The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the streets of Millbrook, Colorado territory, where the year 1887 had already begun showing its teeth. Frost clung to the boardwalks despite the afternoon sun, and the mountain peaks loomed like silent judges over the valley below. In the town square, beneath the shadow of the old trading post, a crowd had gathered for the weekly market. They came for tools, livestock, and provisions, but today they would witness something else entirely. Something that would make them shift their boots and look away, pretending they hadn't seen what they came to watch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Rachel Harper, 24 years old, standing in a dress the color of faded sage. Her auburn hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her pale skin across sharp cheekbones. Her hands weren't clenched like fists, but pressed flat against her thighs, as though she was trying to hold herself together from the outside in. The crowd formed a loose circle around her, not quite close enough to touch, but near enough to hear every word that would seal her fate. Her father, William Harper, stood beside her like a man conducting business at a livestock auction. His voice carried across the square, rough and matter-of-fact, as if he were selling a plow horse that had gone lame. "She's strong enough to work a full day, can read and write better than most, and keeps a clean house," he announced, his weathered hands gesturing toward Rachel as though she were merchandise. Any man with steady income and a need for a woman around the place ought to consider this opportunity. The crowd stirred, boots shuffling against the wooden planks. A few men nodded, others whispered behind gloved hands. Women pulled their shawls tighter and studied the ground, their children peeking out from behind skirts with wide, curious eyes. Rachel stood motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the valley, beyond anything that existed in this moment. The morning had started differently for Rachel Harper. She had woken in her childhood bed in the small room above her father's general store, believing she had 3 more days before this moment arrived. 3 days to find work in Cedar Falls, or convince someone to take her on as a seamstress, or discover some other path that wouldn't lead to this public humiliation. But William Harper had decided that 3 days was too long to feed a mouth that brought him no profit, too long to house a daughter who had failed at the one thing women were supposed to do well. The failure had been announced 2 months earlier, when Daniel Whitmore had arrived at the Harper household with his hat in his hands and his decision made. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of hoping and waiting and praying, and nothing to show for it but empty rooms and disappointed in-laws. Daniel had been patient, even kind, in his own way. He never raised his voice, never struck her, never called her the names that other women whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. He simply grew quieter with each passing month, until their house felt like a church after the congregation had gone home. "It's not personal, Rachel," he had said, standing in the parlor while her mother served coffee in the good china. "You're a fine woman, and you've been a good wife to me. But my family needs heirs, and we both know that's not going to happen with us." He had paused then, his fingers working the brim of his hat. "I've spoken to the minister. The marriage can be dissolved quietly, no fault assigned. You can keep the household items we purchased together, and I'll make sure you have enough money to get settled somewhere new." Rachel had nodded, because what else could she do? Thank him for his consideration? Argue that 3 years wasn't long enough to know for certain? Beg him to try for another season, another year? She had tried begging once before, in the privacy of their bedroom, when the second winter of their marriage had passed without any sign of the children they both wanted. The memory of her own voice, high and desperate in the darkness, still made her throat close up. Her mother, Margaret Harper, had accepted Daniel's announcement with the resignation of a woman who had expected this outcome from the beginning. "We'll manage," she had said simply, pouring cream into her coffee with steady hands. Rachel's always been resourceful. She'd find her way. But finding her way and being allowed to find her way were different things entirely, as Rachel had discovered over the following weeks. The problem wasn't just that she was a woman without a husband in a territory where unmarried women were viewed with suspicion and pity. The problem was that she was a woman who had failed at marriage, failed at the fundamental purpose that justified her existence in the minds of most people. She wasn't a widow, which would have garnered sympathy and respect. She wasn't a spinster who had never tried, which would have earned understanding if not approval. She was something worse, something broken in a specific way that made decent. Families nervous about hiring her and unmarried men wary of courting her. The general store couldn't support another mouth indefinitely, and William Harper had made that clear with increasingly pointed comments about winter supplies and stretched resources. When Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house had mentioned that she might need help with laundry and cooking, Rachel had walked the 3 miles to Cedar Falls with hope lifting her steps. But Mrs. Patterson had taken one look at her and asked, with careful politeness, whether there might be any possibility of her reconciling with her husband. When Rachel had explained that the marriage was dissolved, Mrs. Patterson had pressed her lips together and found reasons why the position wasn't really available after all. The same conversation had repeated itself with variations throughout the valley. The schoolteacher position had been filled by a woman from Denver. The seamstress work had gone to a widow with 3 children who needed the income more. The hotel in Cedar Falls already had sufficient staff. Each rejection had been delivered kindly, but the message was clear: a woman who couldn't keep a husband was a risk that respectable establishments couldn't afford to take. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So when William Harper had announced at breakfast that morning that he had found a solution to their situation, Rachel had felt the last of her hope settle into her stomach like a stone. The solution involved the weekly market, where men from outlying homesteads and mining camps sometimes came looking for wives, housekeepers, or women willing to work for room and board. It was not uncommon, her father had explained with forced cheerfulness, for practical arrangements to be made this way. Many successful marriages had started with nothing more than mutual need and good intentions. Now standing in the center of the town square with the afternoon shadows growing longer, Rachel understood that her father's solution was less about her welfare and more about his own convenience. The crowd around her was composed mostly of curious onlookers rather than serious bidders, people who had come to witness the spectacle rather than participate in it. The few men who showed genuine interest were either too old, too poor, or too rough around the edges to have found wives through conventional means. "She's been married before," William continued, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Knows how to manage a household, how to make a dollar stretch. The previous arrangement didn't work out, but that's nobody's fault. Sometimes these things just don't take, like seeds in poor soil." He paused, glancing at Rachel with what might have been apologetic discomfort. "She's healthy, she's willing to work, and she won't give you any trouble about moving wherever you need to go." Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame exactly, but from the strange sensation of being discussed as though she weren't present. She wanted to speak, to correct the implications in her father's words, to explain that her marriage had failed for reasons beyond anyone's control. But she had learned over the past 2 months that explanations only made things worse, that the more she tried to defend herself, the more people seemed to believe she was hiding something shameful. A man near the front of the crowd shifted his weight and raised his hand slightly. "What kind of work is she used to?" he asked. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and clothes that suggested he owned a small farm or business. His question was practical rather than unkind, but Rachel noticed the way he looked at her, assessing her like livestock at auction. "General store work, household management, some cooking and sewing," William replied promptly. "She can read." and cipher better than most men, keeps neat records, knows how to deal with suppliers and customers. She's been helping run my store since she was old enough to reach the counter." Another voice called out from the back of the crowd. "What about the medical situation? She see a doctor about her condition?" The question was asked by a woman, one of the shopkeeper's wives, with the kind of avid curiosity that masqueraded as concern. Rachel's hands pressed harder against her thighs. This was the question she had been dreading, the one that would reduce her to a list of physical failings and mysterious inadequacies. William Harper's expression tightened slightly, but he answered with the same businesslike tone he used for all difficult inquiries. "She's been examined by Doc Morrison in Cedar Falls," he said. "He found no obvious problems, said sometimes these things are just a matter of timing and luck. She's young and healthy, no reason to think the situation is permanent." He cleared his throat. The previous husband was perhaps impatient, didn't give things enough time to develop naturally. The lie was delivered smoothly, but Rachel recognized it for what it was, a face-saving fabrication that placed the blame on Daniel Whitmer's character rather than her own biology. In truth, Doc Morrison had been far less optimistic, using words like complications and unlikely and alternative arrangements. But the truth would have made her completely unmarketable, and William Harper was nothing if not a practical businessman. The afternoon sun slanted lower, casting longer shadows across the square. A few people began to drift away, their curiosity satisfied and their evening chores calling them home. Rachel realized that her father's confidence in finding a quick solution had been misplaced, that she might return to the general store that evening without any resolution to her situation. The prospect filled her with something that might have been relief, except that it only postponed the inevitable rather than solving it. Then she heard bootsteps approaching from behind the crowd, steady and unhurried. People began to turn, craning their necks to see who was coming. The footsteps belonged to a man who moved with the deliberate pace of someone accustomed to covering long distances on foot, someone who didn't hurry because he had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. The crowd parted slightly, creating a narrow path toward the center of the square. Rachel caught her first glimpse of him as he emerged from the shadows cast by the trading post. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that looked like it had been cut with a hunting knife and clothes that bore the stains and wear of serious outdoor work. His face was weathered in the way that came from spending years in mountain weather, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his 30s. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But what struck Rachel most was the way he moved through the crowd. He didn't push or shove, didn't demand attention or acknowledgement. He simply walked steadily forward, and people stepped aside for him naturally, the way they might move out of the path of a river or a strong wind. There was something in his bearing that commanded respect without demanding it, something that made the gossiping voices fade into silence. When he reached the center of the square, he stopped perhaps 10 feet away from Rachel and her father. He didn't look her over the way the other interested men had done, didn't assess her like merchandise or examine her for obvious defects. Instead, he removed his hat, a simple gesture of politeness that somehow carried more weight than all the elaborate courtesies she had witnessed in town parlors. "Thomas McKenna," he said, his voice carrying easily without being loud. "I have a cabin up near Copper Ridge, about 8 miles north of here." He paused, his gaze moving from William Harper to Rachel and back again. "I heard you're looking to make an arrangement for the lady." William straightened, sensing a serious inquiry at last. "That's right, Mr. McKenna. My daughter Rachel needs a new situation, and she's willing to work hard for the right opportunity." He gestured toward Rachel with renewed enthusiasm. "As I was telling the others, she's experienced with household management. She's literate and reliable, and she's looking for a permanent arrangement rather than temporary employment." Thomas McKenna nodded slowly, but his attention had shifted to Rachel herself. When he looked at her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the sensation of being seen as a person rather than a problem to be solved. His eyes were brown, she noticed, the color of pine bark after rain, and they held her gaze steadily without making her feel exposed or examined. "What kind of arrangement are you hoping for, Miss Harper?" he asked, addressing her directly rather than speaking about her to her father. The question caught her off guard, partly because it was the first time anyone had asked her opinion about her own future, and partly because his voice held genuine interest in her answer. Rachel felt the attention of the entire crowd focused on her, waiting for her response. She realized that this was her opportunity to speak for herself, to explain what she wanted rather than what others had decided she needed. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. "I'm looking for honest work and a place where I can be useful," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I don't need charity, and I'm not looking for easy circumstances. I just want the chance to prove that I'm worth more than my previous situation might suggest." Something shifted in Thomas McKenna's expression, a subtle change that might have been approval or recognition. He nodded once, then turned back to William Harper. "What are your terms?" "Well now," William began, warming to the negotiation. "Rachel comes with her personal belongings, some household items from her previous marriage, and enough clothing for all seasons. She's got experience managing money and supplies. She can read and write contracts, and she knows how to deal with difficult customers." He paused, glancing around the crowd as though reminding them that other buyers might still emerge. "I'm looking for a man who can provide steady room and board, fair treatment, and a secure long-term situation. In return, Rachel will handle all domestic responsibilities and contribute her skills to whatever enterprise you're running." Thomas McKenna listened to this recitation without comment, his hat still held respectfully in his hands. When William finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the terms or perhaps weighing something else entirely. "I've got 5 children at home," he said finally. "Lost their mother to pneumonia 2 years back, and I've been managing on my own since then." He looked directly at Rachel again. "It's not easy work, keeping house for 6 people in mountain country. The cabin's solid, but it's not fancy. Food's plain, but there's plenty of it. The children are good kids, but they need more than I can give them on my own." Rachel felt her heart rate quicken. This was different from what she had expected, different from the vague offers of housekeeping or companionship that other men might have proposed. Thomas McKenna was offering her a real role, real responsibilities, a chance to be genuinely needed rather than merely tolerated. "What ages are the children?" she asked, stepping slightly forward without conscious decision. "Benjamin's 14. Lucas is 11. Peter's 9. Emma's 7. And Timothy just turned 5, he replied. "The older boys help with outside work, but they all need looking after. Emma especially misses having a woman around, and Timothy's still young enough to need constant watching." William Harper cleared his throat, perhaps concerned that Rachel was becoming too involved in the conversation. "What kind of compensation are you prepared to offer?" he asked, bringing the discussion back to practical matters. Thomas McKenna reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, not unlike the one B.O. had produced in the original story, but worn and softened by years of use. He opened it carefully, revealing silver coins that caught the afternoon light. $50, he said, placing the money on the wooden crate that William had been using as a makeshift podium. "Fair payment for fair work, and she wants for nothing as long as she's willing to stay." The amount was more generous than Rachel had expected, more than her father had probably hoped for. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some expressing surprise at the sum, others perhaps questioning whether any woman was worth such an investment. William Harper's eyes brightened as he reached for the pouch, but Thomas McKenna's hand moved slightly, not quite touching the money but clearly indicating that the transaction wasn't complete. "One condition," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "She comes as a free woman making her own choice, not as property being sold. If she decides after a fair trial that the situation doesn't suit her, she's free to leave with enough money to get settled elsewhere." He paused, his gaze moving between Rachel and her father. "And she's treated with respect in my house. No one questions her worth or her right to be there." The words hit Rachel like a physical force, so unexpected that she actually took a step backward. In all the negotiations and discussions about her future, no one had ever suggested that her own wishes might matter, that she might have the right to change her mind or demand decent treatment. Thomas McKenna was offering her not just employment, but dignity. William Harper looked less pleased with this condition, perhaps recognizing that it reduced his leverage in the transaction. "Now see here," he began, but Thomas McKenna cut him off with a gesture. "Those are my terms," he said simply. "Take them or leave them, but I won't negotiate a person's freedom." Rachel found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to do so. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. "I accept your offer, Mr. McKenna." The Mountain Man Story, Parts 2 to 5. The silence that followed Rachel's acceptance stretched across the town square. Like morning mist, thick and uncomfortable. She could feel the weight of every gaze, hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted their positions to get a better view of this unexpected development. Her father's expression had transformed from pleased satisfaction to something approaching concern, as though he was only now realizing that he had lost control of the situation entirely. Thomas McKenna nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that carried more finality than a dozen handshakes might have managed. He stepped forward and placed the leather pouch in William Harper's outstretched palm, but his eyes remained fixed on Rachel's face. "We'll leave within the hour," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she and her father could hear clearly. "Pack light, but bring whatever matters to you. The wagon's loaded with winter supplies, so there's not much room for extras." Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. An hour, 60 minutes to gather the remnants of her old life and prepare for whatever came next. It seemed both impossibly short and longer than she could bear to wait. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, their entertainment concluded and their curiosity satisfied for the moment. But she could feel their attention lingering, could sense the conversations that would spring up in parlors and shops before the sun set. Discussions about the Harper girl and the mountain man who had paid good money for damaged goods. William Harper hefted the pouch, testing its weight with the practiced motion of a man accustomed to evaluating currency. His earlier enthusiasm had cooled considerably, replaced by something that might have been second thoughts or simple paternal concern. Arriving fashionably late to the proceedings. "You sure about this, Rachel?" he asked, though whether he was questioning her decision or his own remained unclear. "Copper Ridge is a long way from town, and winter comes early up in those mountains. If things don't work out the way you're hoping, they'll work out fine," Thomas McKenna interrupted, though his tone carried reassurance rather than irritation. "Your daughter will be treated fairly, and she'll have everything she needs to be comfortable and safe." He turned to Rachel, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both formal and somehow intimate. "I'll wait by the blacksmith's shop when you're ready. Take whatever time you need to say your goodbyes." He walked away without waiting for a response, moving through the remaining crowd with the same unhurried confidence he had displayed upon arriving. Rachel watched him go, noting the way people automatically stepped aside for him, the respectful nods he received from the merchants and tradesmen. Whatever reputation Thomas McKenna had built in this valley, it was clearly one that commanded genuine respect rather than mere tolerance. Her father's hand touched her elbow, drawing her attention back to the immediate situation. "Come on then," he said, his voice gruff with emotions he couldn't quite name. Your mother will want to help you pack, and there are things we need to discuss before you go." They walked together toward the general store, their footsteps echoing hollowly on the wooden boardwalk. Behind them, the town square began to return to its normal rhythm of afternoon commerce, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The apartment above the store felt smaller than Rachel remembered, cramped and overstuffed with the accumulation of years spent in the same rooms. Her mother, Margaret Harper, was waiting for them at the top of the stairs, her face composed but her hands betraying her nervousness as they twisted the fabric of her apron. She had obviously been watching from the window, had seen the entire transaction unfold in the square below. "So it's decided then," Margaret said. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. She looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman trying to reconcile herself to an outcome she had always known was inevitable, but had hoped might somehow be avoided. "Thomas McKenna seems like a decent man, from what I've heard. His wife Emma was well regarded before she passed. May she rest in peace." Rachel felt a flutter of something that might have been curiosity or anxiety at the mention of the first Mrs. McKenna. She realized that she knew almost nothing about the woman whose place she would be taking, whose children she would be caring for, whose memory would undoubtedly linger in every corner of the mountain cabin. The thought made her stomach tighten, with a new variety of nervousness, one that had nothing to do with practical concerns about cooking and cleaning, and everything to do with the impossible task of filling a void left by someone who had been genuinely loved and mourned. "What was she like?" Rachel asked, settling onto the narrow bed that had been hers since childhood. The quilt beneath her was one her grandmother had made, pieced together from scraps of fabric that told the story of a dozen different dresses and aprons and household linens. Soon it would be one of the few familiar things surrounding her in an entirely new life. Margaret Harper moved to the small dresser and began pulling out items of clothing, sorting them into piles with the efficiency of long practice. Emma McKenna was a gentle soul, from what I remember. Came from a good family down in Denver. Met Thomas when her father was doing business with one of the mining operations up in the mountains. She adapted well to mountain life, from all accounts, though it couldn't have been easy leaving city comforts behind. She paused in her sorting, holding a woolen shawl up to the window light to check for moth holes. She had a gift with children, her own and others. Always seemed to know exactly what they needed, whether it was discipline or comfort or just someone to listen to their troubles. The information settled into Rachel's mind like seeds in prepared soil, each detail taking root and beginning to grow into larger concerns. Emma McKenna had been beloved, successful, perfectly suited to the life that Rachel was about to attempt. She had chosen that life freely, had gone into it with love and optimism and the support of both families. Rachel, by contrast, was arriving as a purchased solution to a practical problem, carrying nothing but her own failures and the desperate hope that she might prove useful enough to justify her presence. William Harper appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what McKenna said, about you being free to leave if things don't work out." He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "That's all well and good in theory, but the reality is that you'll be 8 miles from town, in country that gets snowed in for months at a time. If you decide you want to leave, come January, you might not have the option until spring thaw." Rachel had considered this already, had weighed the risks of isolation against the certainty of having nowhere else to go. "I understand that," she said quietly. "But I also understand that this might be my only real chance to build something worthwhile with my life. I'm not going into this blindly, Papa. I know it won't be easy." Her mother folded the last of the clothing and placed it carefully in the canvas traveling bag that had once belonged to Rachel's grandfather. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral, "about why your marriage to Daniel really ended." She glanced at her husband, who nodded reluctantly. "It wasn't just that you couldn't conceive, though that was certainly part of it. Daniel's mother had very specific ideas about what kind of wife her son deserved. And she made it clear that you weren't meeting her expectations in other ways as well. Rachel felt her cheeks grow warm. What other ways? You were too independent, William said bluntly. Too willing to speak your mind, too interested in things that weren't considered appropriate for a woman in her position. Daniel's mother felt that you were undermining his authority by having opinions about business matters and expressing them to customers in the store. She convinced him that your strong personality was part of why the marriage wasn't producing the results they wanted. The revelation hit Rachel like cold water, clarifying things that had confused her for months. She had always assumed that her childlessness was the sole reason for Daniel's growing distance, had blamed herself entirely for the failure of their relationship. Learning that her intelligence and independence had also been viewed as defects rather than assets was simultaneously devastating and oddly liberating. So I was failing as a wife in multiple ways, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Good to know. That's not what we're saying, Margaret interjected quickly. What we're saying is that you were failing to be the kind of wife that Daniel and his family wanted, which isn't the same thing at all. Some men appreciate a woman who can think for herself and contribute more than just domestic labor to a household. Thomas McKenna strikes me as that kind of man, from what I observed today. Rachel considered this as she moved around the small room, gathering the personal items that would accompany her to her new life. A silver brush that had been her grandmother's, the Bible her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, a small wooden box containing the few pieces of jewelry she owned, including her wedding ring, which she had continued wearing out of habit rather than sentiment. As she packed each item, she found herself wondering what kind of woman Thomas McKenna had been married to, whether Emma had been the sort to keep her opinions to herself or to offer them freely. The sound of wagon wheels on cobblestones drew their attention to the window. Thomas McKenna had positioned his wagon in front of the store, the mules standing patiently in their traces while he secured the load of supplies under a canvas tarp. Even from the second-story window, Rachel could see the careful way he arranged everything, ensuring that weight was distributed evenly and that nothing would shift during the journey ahead. He's ready, William observed, though there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely ready himself. You'd best finish up here and get yourself downstairs. Rachel took one last look around the room that had sheltered her childhood and the early years of her womanhood. The space seemed to hold the echoes of every conversation she had shared with her parents, every dream she had harbored, every disappointment she had endured. Tomorrow night she would sleep in a different bed, in a different place, surrounded by the belongings and memories of strangers who would now be her responsibility. Her mother pressed a small wrapped bundle into her hands. Herbs and medicines, Margaret explained. Willow bark for fevers, mint for stomach troubles, chamomile for nerves. There's a midwife up in Cedar Falls, but she's not always easy to reach when the weather turns bad. These might come in handy if someone gets sick. The gift was practical, but also deeply personal, acknowledgement that Rachel would be responsible for the health and welfare of 5 children in an isolated location. It represented her mother's confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges might arise, and Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes as she tucked the bundle carefully into her bag. The 3 of them made their way downstairs and out onto the boardwalk, where Thomas McKenna was waiting beside his wagon. He had changed into a heavy coat and had pulled a wool hat down over his dark hair, preparations for the mountain journey that lay ahead. When he saw Rachel emerge from the store, he stepped forward to take her traveling bag, handling it with the same careful attention he had given to arranging his supply load. Everything you need? He asked, securing her belongings under the tarp alongside sacks of flour and beans and other winter necessities. Everything that matters, Rachel replied, though the words felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what she was leaving behind. William Harper cleared his throat, a sound that drew everyone's attention. McKenna, he said formally. "I want your word that my daughter will be treated with kindness and respect in your household. She's had enough of being made to feel worthless for things beyond her control." Thomas McKenna met the older man's gaze steadily. "She'll be welcomed and valued for exactly who she is," he said simply. "You have my word on that." The handshake that followed sealed more than a business transaction. It marked the end of Rachel's life as William Harper's daughter, and the beginning of her existence as something else entirely, something that had yet to be defined or named. She embraced her parents quickly, fighting back tears that would serve no useful purpose, and allowed Thomas McKenna to help her up onto the wagon seat. The mules responded to his quiet command and began to move, their hooves striking a steady rhythm against the cobblestones as the wagon rolled through Millbrook's main street. Rachel looked back once to see her parents standing in front of the general store, their figures growing smaller with each turn of the wheels. Then Thomas McKenna guided the team around a bend in the road, and the town disappeared behind a stand of pine trees, as though it had never existed at all. The road to Copper Ridge climbed steadily from the valley floor, winding through forests of pine and aspen that showed the first touches of autumn color. The air grew thinner and colder as they gained elevation, and Rachel pulled her cloak more tightly around her shoulders. Beside her, Thomas McKenna drove with the relaxed competence of a man who had traveled this route countless times, his hands steady on the reins and his attention divided between the road ahead and the subtle signs of weather that might affect their journey. For the first hour, they rode in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the arrangement they had just entered into. Rachel found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to imagine what it would look like covered in snow, trying to picture herself as part of this mountain world rather than merely passing through it. The trees seemed larger here than they had in the valley, older and more permanent, as though they had been standing in these exact positions since the world began. "Tell me about the children," she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to become noticeable. "What should I know about them before I meet them?" Thomas McKenna considered the question as they navigated a particularly steep section of road. "Benjamin's the oldest, and he's been trying to be the man of the house since his mother died. He works harder than he should for a boy his age, and he worries about things that ought to be my responsibility. He'll probably be suspicious of you at first, wondering if you're going to try to replace his mother or change the way we do things." Rachel nodded, recognizing the challenge that lay ahead with the eldest child. Boys of 14 were neither children nor adults, caught in the difficult space between dependence and independence. A boy who had shouldered adult responsibilities after his mother's death would be especially resistant to any changes that might threaten his sense of importance or control. "Lucas is quieter, more thoughtful," Thomas continued. "He's the one who notices things, who remembers details that other people might miss. He was closest to his mother, I think, and her death hit him particularly hard. He doesn't talk about her much, but he keeps a pressed flower from her garden in his prayer book, and he still sets a place for her at Sunday dinner sometimes." The image of a grieving 11-year-old boy carefully preserving his mother's memory made Rachel's throat tighten with sympathy. She wondered whether Lucas would see her as an intruder attempting to occupy sacred space, or whether his need for maternal comfort might eventually overcome his loyalty to the past. Peter is the practical joker, always finding ways to make his brothers laugh or get into harmless trouble. He's the one who brings home wounded birds and stray cats, convinced he can nurse them back to health. Emma used to say he had too much heart for his own good. Thomas's voice softened when he mentioned his late wife, taking on the gentle tone that people use when speaking of beloved dead. "And Emma, your daughter?" Rachel prompted, curious about the only girl in the family. "Emma is 7, and she's been trying to take care of everyone since she lost her mother. She attempts to cook breakfast sometimes, though she's not tall enough to reach the stove safely. She mends her brother's clothes with stitches that are more enthusiastic than skillful. She's appointed herself the keeper of family traditions, making sure we observe her mother's birthday and the anniversary of her death, insisting that we maintain routines that her mother established. Rachel felt a pang of recognition, remembering her own childhood attempts to fill adult roles when circumstances demanded more maturity than her age should have required. The little girl was clearly struggling with the same impossible burden that weighed on her oldest brother, the sense that family stability depended on her ability to be more than she was developmentally capable of being. And Timothy? Timothy is 5, and he doesn't really remember his mother clearly anymore, which might be a blessing in some ways. He knows that she existed and that she loved him, but he doesn't have the same sharp sense of loss that affects the others. He's still young enough to accept new people and situations without too much resistance, as long as his basic needs are met and he feels secure. The wagon had been climbing steadily as they talked, and now they emerged from a thick stand of pines onto a natural shelf of rock that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. Millbrook looked like a collection of toy buildings from this height, connected by ribbon roads and surrounded by fields that had been reduced to geometric patterns of brown and gold. The autumn sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas McKenna brought the wagon to a halt at the edge of the overlook and set the brake with practiced efficiency. "We'll rest the mules here for a few minutes," he explained, climbing down from the seat and moving to check the harness and load. "It's another hour to the cabin, mostly downhill from here, but I want to make sure everything's secure before we tackle the steeper sections." Rachel remained seated, overwhelmed by the vastness of the view spread out below them. She had never been this high above the world before, had never experienced the peculiar sensation of seeing familiar landmarks reduced to miniature versions of themselves. The perspective made her feel simultaneously significant and insignificant, as though she were surveying her domain from a position of power, while also recognizing how small and temporary her presence was in the grand scheme of mountain geography. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it sincerely, but also recognizing the inadequacy of the word to capture the full impact of the scene before them. "Emma used to say that living up here was like being closer to heaven," Thomas replied, joining her on the wagon seat and following her gaze across the valley. She claimed she could think more clearly in the mountains, that the thin air somehow made room for bigger thoughts and deeper feelings. The mention of his late wife's philosophy hung between them like a bridge, connecting Rachel's present experience to the history of the woman whose place she was taking. She wondered whether Thomas McKenna was offering the comparison as a compliment or as a challenge, whether he expected her to appreciate the mountain landscape in the same way Emma had, or whether he was simply sharing a memory that the view had triggered. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Rachel said carefully, testing the waters of a conversation that could easily become treacherous. "She was," Thomas agreed simply, without elaboration or comparison. "She found joy in simple things, and strength in difficult ones. The children were blessed to have her for the time they did." The statement was both a tribute to his late wife and a subtle indication that Rachel was not expected to compete with Emma's memory or attempt to replicate her approach to family life. She felt a measure of relief at this recognition, coupled with the sobering awareness that she would need to find her own way of connecting with 5 children who had already experienced the loss of someone irreplaceable. Thomas McKenna climbed down from the wagon again and made a final check of the mules and equipment. The animals stood patiently in their traces, their breath visible in the cooling air, their ears switching occasionally at sounds that human ears couldn't detect. They were mountain-bred beasts, accustomed to steep roads and changeable weather, and they waited with the philosophical resignation of creatures who understood that their job was to carry loads from one place to another regardless of conditions. "Ready?" Thomas asked, returning to his seat and releasing the brake. Rachel nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain what she was agreeing to be ready for. The immediate journey to the cabin, certainly, but also everything that would follow. All the unknown challenges and responsibilities that waited in a life she could barely imagine. The wagon lurched forward and began its descent from the overlook, following a road that curved around the mountainside like a snake navigating rocky terrain. As they descended, the forest closed around them again, creating a tunnel of pine branches that filtered the late afternoon light into patterns of gold and shadow. The air smelled of resin and wood smoke, suggesting that they were approaching human habitation. That somewhere ahead lay the cabin, where 5 children were waiting for their father to return with winter supplies and an unexpected addition to their household. The road made one final turn around a massive boulder, and suddenly the McKenna homestead spread out before them like a scene from a carefully composed painting. The cabin was larger than Rachel had expected, built of logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color that seemed to blend naturally with the surrounding forest. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and warm light glowed in windows that had been fitted with real glass rather than oiled paper or wooden shutters. A barn stood behind the main building, along with a chicken coop, a root cellar, and various other outbuildings that suggested a well-established and prosperous operation. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, occupied a sunny clearing to the south of the cabin. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, its water sparkling as it caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. But what captured Rachel's attention most immediately were the 5 figures who had emerged from the cabin at the sound of the approaching wagon. They arranged themselves on the covered porch in order of height, like steps leading up to adulthood, and watched with the wide-eyed curiosity and caution that children display when confronting significant changes in their familiar world. Benjamin, the 14-year-old, stood slightly apart from his younger siblings, his posture straight and his expression serious. He wore clothes that were clean but patched, and his hair had been combed with the careful attention that suggested he had prepared himself to meet his father's mysterious passenger. Beside him, Lucas clutched a book against his chest like a shield, while Peter bounced slightly on his toes with barely contained energy. Emma, the only girl, held Timothy's hand with protective firmness, her free hand smoothing her dress in the unconscious gesture of a hostess preparing to greet guests. The youngest boy leaned against his sister's side, thumb in his mouth despite being 5 years old, his eyes huge with curiosity and uncertainty. Thomas McKenna brought the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and set the brake with movements that seemed deliberately calm and unhurried. He climbed down from the driver's seat and turned to help Rachel descend, his hands steady and impersonal as they assisted her to the ground. The simple courtesy felt significant in this context, a public demonstration that she would be treated with respect and consideration in her new home. "Children," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between the wagon and the porch, "this is Miss Rachel Harper. She's come to help us manage the household and take care of things that have been getting overlooked lately." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "I expect you to treat her with courtesy and respect, and to follow her instructions the same way you would follow mine." The introduction was simple and practical, focusing on function rather than emotion, authority rather than affection. Rachel appreciated the approach, recognizing that it established her position without creating unrealistic expectations about instant family bonds or immediate maternal connections. She would earn her place in this household through competence and consistency, not through sentimental appeals or forced intimacy. She stepped forward, closing some of the distance between herself and the children, but stopped well short of the porch to avoid seeming intrusive or overly eager. "I'm pleased to meet all of you," she said, her voice pitched to carry warmth without overwhelming them with unfamiliar enthusiasm. "I hope we'll get along well together." Benjamin nodded formally, a gesture that seemed more adult than his 14 years should have required. "Welcome to our home, Miss Harper," he said, the words carefully chosen and properly pronounced. "We've prepared the guest room for you, and Emma has helped me organize the household schedule so you can see how we usually manage things." The boy's careful politeness revealed both his natural courtesy and his determination to maintain some measure of control over the changes that were being introduced to his family. By taking charge of preparations and presentations, he was asserting his role as the responsible older brother while also demonstrating that the household had been functioning adequately without outside help. Lucas stepped forward slightly still, clutching his book. "Are you going to stay through the winter?" he asked, his question direct and practical. "Papa said you might, but we wanted to be sure before we moved things around in the cabin." The inquiry revealed the children's awareness that Rachel's presence was experimental rather than permanent, that her position in their household was conditional on everyone's satisfaction with the arrangement. It also demonstrated their practical understanding of mountain life, their recognition that winter weather would make travel difficult, and that decisions about household composition needed to be made with seasonal realities in mind. "I'm planning to stay," Rachel replied honestly, "but I understand that depends on whether we all find that the arrangement works well for everyone involved. I hope it will, but I want you to know that your comfort and happiness in your own home is the most important consideration." Emma released Timothy's hand and stepped forward with the careful dignity of a hostess twice her age. "Would you like to see your room now?" she asked politely. "I put fresh bedding on the mattress and made sure there were enough blankets for mountain nights. Mama always said that guests should feel welcome and comfortable." The mention of their mother was casual rather than pointed, suggesting that Emma's memories of maternal hospitality were integrated naturally into her understanding of how households should be managed. Rachel felt a flutter of gratitude for the little girl's matter-of-fact acceptance, coupled with awareness that Emma's apparent composure might be masking deeper concerns about her own position in a family that was about to include another adult woman. Peter had been fidgeting with increasing energy during these formal exchanges, and now he burst out with the question that had obviously been consuming him. "Do you know any good stories?" he demanded. "Mama used to tell us stories before bedtime, but Papa doesn't remember them right, and Benjamin says he's too old for such things." The request was both an invitation and a test, an opportunity for Rachel to demonstrate her suitability for the maternal role while also revealing whether she understood the specific needs and interests of 7 different personalities. Peter's question also highlighted one of the practical gaps that had been left by Emma McKenna's death, the kind of intimate family ritual that fathers might not think to maintain or might not feel comfortable attempting to replicate. "I know some stories," Rachel said, smiling at Peter's enthusiasm, "though I'll have to remember which ones are appropriate for different ages. Maybe we can start with something simple tonight, after everyone has had dinner and finished their evening chores." Timothy had been watching this entire exchange with the wide-eyed fascination of a child observing adult interactions that would significantly affect his daily life. Now he released his thumb from his mouth and spoke in the clear, piping voice of someone young enough to ask questions that older children might consider too personal. "Are you going to be our new mama?" he asked, his question cutting straight through the careful politeness that had characterized the other introductions. The words fell into sudden silence, creating a moment of suspended tension as everyone waited to see how Rachel would handle this most fundamental and delicate inquiry. She looked at Timothy's upturned face, recognizing both his natural curiosity and his genuine need for clarity about relationships that would shape his daily experience. "I'm going to take care of you and help your family," she said gently, kneeling down so that she could speak to him at eye level. "But you already have a mama, even though she's not here with you anymore. I can't replace her, and I wouldn't try to. I'll just be Miss Rachel, and I'll do my best to make sure you have everything you need." The answer satisfied Timothy, who nodded solemnly and returned his thumb to his mouth. But Rachel could see that her response had been noted carefully by the older children as well, that her acknowledgement of their mother's irreplaceable position had been weighed and apparently approved. The subtle relaxation in Benjamin's posture suggested that she had passed some sort of test, that her approach to the family's most sensitive dynamics had met with tentative acceptance. Thomas McKenna had been unloading supplies from the wagon during these introductions, but Rachel noticed that he had positioned himself to overhear the conversations between her and the children. His movements suggested approval of her careful navigation of difficult emotional territory, though he made no direct comment on the exchanges that had taken place. "Benjamin, Lucas, come help me get these supplies stored properly," he called, drawing the older boys away from the porch and toward the more immediate task of preparing for winter. "The sooner we get everything under cover, the sooner we can have a proper dinner and give Miss Harper a chance to settle in." The boys responded immediately to their father's direction, jumping down from the porch with the eager energy of children who understood their role in family operations. Rachel watched them work together, noting the easy cooperation between father and sons, the practiced efficiency that spoke of established routines and shared responsibilities. Emma approached her with the careful formality of a hostess fulfilling social obligations. "Would you like me to show you to your room now?" she asked politely. "I can help you unpack your things, and then I can explain about dinner preparations and morning chores." The offer was generous and practical, but Rachel sensed the underlying currents of a 7-year-old girl, trying to maintain control over household operations that had become her responsibility in the absence of adult female supervision. Emma's careful management of domestic details revealed both her competence and her burden, the weight of responsibilities that were too heavy for her small shoulders. "I would appreciate that very much," Rachel replied, "but I hope you'll let me help with dinner preparations. I'd like to learn how you usually do things, so I can fit in with your established routines rather than disrupting them." The response seemed to please Emma, who nodded seriously and led the way into the cabin. The interior was larger and more comfortable than Rachel had expected, with plastered walls, wooden floors, and furniture that showed signs of skilled craftsmanship. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls that were decorated with simple curtains and a few family photographs. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large table that could accommodate the entire family, shelves lined with books and household items, and a cooking area that included both a wood-burning stove and fireplace implements for preparing meals. Everything was clean and well organized, though Rachel's experienced eye noted small signs of domestic strain, places where maintenance had been deferred or where children's efforts had been adequate without being thorough. Emma led her to a small room off the main area, a space that had obviously been prepared with great care for her arrival. The bed was narrow but comfortable, covered with a quilt that showed signs of recent mending. A wash basin sat on a simple wooden stand, accompanied by towels that had been folded with mathematical precision. A small window looked out toward the forest, and a wooden peg near the door provided a place to hang clothing. "This was Mama's sewing room," Emma explained matter-of-factly, "but we moved her things to the attic after she died, and Papa said it would make a good bedroom for a lady who came to help us." She paused, studying Rachel's face with the serious attention that children bring to adult emotions. "We tried to make it nice, but we weren't sure what ladies prefer." The room was indeed nice, comfortable, and private, while remaining integrated into the family living space. Rachel could see signs of the children's efforts to prepare for her arrival, small touches that revealed their desire to make a good impression despite their uncertainty about what changes her presence might bring to their established routines. "It's perfect," Rachel said sincerely, settling her traveling bag on the bed and looking around the space that would become her private retreat. "Thank you for taking such good care to make me feel welcome." Emma beamed at the praise, her careful composure giving way momentarily to the natural pleasure of a child whose efforts had been recognized and appreciated. Benjamin helped me with the heavy things, and Lucas found extra blankets in the storage chest. Peter wanted to pick flowers for the washstand, but there aren't many left this late in the season. The mention of her brother's contributions revealed the cooperative effort that had gone into preparing for Rachel's arrival, suggesting that the children had discussed her coming and had worked together to ensure that she would be received properly. The thought of 5 children consulting among themselves about how to welcome a stranger into their home was both touching and slightly overwhelming. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Thomas and the older boys securing the wagon and moving supplies into storage areas. The familiar rhythm of work being accomplished efficiently by people who understood their roles and responsibilities was comforting, suggesting that this household functioned as a genuine team rather than a collection of individuals competing for attention and resources. "Would you like to rest for a few minutes before dinner?" Emma asked, clearly taking her hostess duty seriously. "Or would you prefer to come to the kitchen and see how we usually prepare meals? Papa said you might want to understand our routines before making any changes." The question revealed both Emma's practical intelligence and her underlying concern about maintaining familiar patterns in a world that had already been disrupted by profound loss. Rachel recognized the delicate balance she would need to strike between contributing her skills and experience, while respecting the systems that had allowed this family to function during their period of grief and adjustment. "I think I'd like to help with dinner preparations," Rachel decided. "That way I can see how you manage things and perhaps contribute something useful right from the beginning." Emma nodded approvingly and led the way back to the main room, where the sounds and smells of domestic activity were already beginning to fill the space. Through the windows, Rachel could see that the autumn afternoon was drawing toward evening, that the time for formal introductions and careful politeness was giving way to the practical business of feeding 6 people and preparing for another mountain night. As she rolled up her sleeves and prepared to join in the essential work of keeping a household functioning, Rachel felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become belonging. She was no longer a woman without a place, without a purpose, without a future worth anticipating. She was someone with immediate responsibilities and the opportunity to make herself useful in ways that mattered to real people facing genuine challenges. The transformation was far from complete, and there would undoubtedly be difficulties and disappointments ahead. But for the first time in months, Rachel Harper felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And that, she thought as she moved toward the kitchen area where Emma was already beginning dinner preparations, was more than enough to build a life upon. The Mountain Man Story, Parts 6 to 9, the kitchen at the McKenna cabin operated with the kind of organized chaos that develops when children take on adult responsibilities out of necessity rather than choice. Emma had appointed herself head cook, though at 7 she required a wooden stool to reach the stove and needed Benjamin's help to lift the heavy cast-iron pots. Lucas had been assigned to table setting and dishwashing duties, while Peter's job was to keep the wood box filled and the fire maintained at appropriate cooking temperature. Rachel observed these arrangements with the careful attention of someone trying to understand established patterns before suggesting improvements. The children moved through their tasks with practiced efficiency, but she could see places where adult supervision might prevent accidents or achieve better results with less effort. Emma's determination to prove her competence led her to attempt tasks that were genuinely dangerous for someone her size, while the older boys seemed to accept their domestic responsibilities without complaint, but also without enthusiasm. "We usually have beans and cornbread for dinner," Emma explained as she struggled to maneuver a heavy pot onto the stove. "Sometimes there's salt pork if Papa's been to town recently, and we have vegetables from the garden until the first hard freeze kills everything off." She paused in her work, looking up at Rachel with the serious expression that seemed to be her default demeanor. Mama used to make better meals, but we do what we can with what we know. The statement was delivered without self-pity or complaint, simply as a factual assessment of their current capabilities compared to their previous standard of living. Rachel felt a surge of admiration for the little girl's practical acceptance of circumstances, coupled with sadness for the losses that had forced such early maturity upon all 5 children. "May I help?" Rachel asked, positioning herself where she could assist without taking over Emma's carefully guarded authority. "I'm good at chopping vegetables and managing multiple pots on the stove at the same time." Emma considered this offer with the gravity of a general evaluating reinforcement troops. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she decided finally. "But I should show you where everything is kept and explain how we usually prepare things. We have our own way of doing most tasks." The tour that followed revealed both the strengths and limitations of child-managed housekeeping. The children had developed systems that worked within their physical and knowledge constraints, but those systems often involved unnecessary steps or accepted suboptimal results, because no adult had been available to teach more efficient methods. Spices were stored too high for easy access, cooking implements were organized by size rather than function, and food preparation took much longer than necessary because no one had learned techniques for streamlining common tasks. Rachel found herself walking the delicate line between offering helpful suggestions and respecting the children's pride in their hard-won competence. When she noticed that Emma was exhausting herself trying to stir a pot of beans that was too heavy for her to manage comfortably, she positioned herself nearby and casually offered to take over stirring duties while Emma attended to other preparations. When she saw Lucas struggling to slice bread with a knife that was too large for his hands, she quietly produced a smaller blade from the knife block and suggested it might work better for his particular task. These small interventions were accepted more readily than direct corrections would have been, allowing the children to maintain their sense of ownership over household operations, while still benefiting from adult expertise. Rachel began to understand that her success in this family would depend largely on her ability to enhance existing systems, rather than replacing them entirely, to work within established hierarchies rather than disrupting them. Thomas and the older boys returned from their supply storing duties as dinner preparations were reaching completion. Benjamin immediately moved to help Emma transfer the heavy pot from stove to table, while Lucas began distributing plates and utensils with the automatic efficiency of long practice. Peter darted outside to ring the dinner bell that would summon Timothy from whatever activity was currently occupying his 5-year-old attention. The dinner bell itself was a piece of family history, a brass bell that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather and had called 3 generations of McKenna family members to meals. The sound carried clearly through the mountain air, a musical note that seemed to belong naturally in the forest setting. Within minutes, Timothy appeared at the Pila cabin door, his face and hands bearing evidence of an afternoon spent exploring the immediate vicinity of the homestead. "Wash up first," Benjamin instructed his youngest brother with the automatic authority of someone who had been managing such details for 2 years. "And use soap, not just water." Timothy complied with only minimal protest, standing on his own wooden stool at the wash basin and making a reasonable effort to remove the day's accumulation of dirt and adventure. His movements had the quick efficiency of a child who had learned that cleanliness requirements were non-negotiable, but also that adult attention spans for supervision were limited. The family gathered around the large table with movements that spoke of well-established routine. Thomas took his place at the head of the table, with Benjamin to his right in what was clearly designated as the position of the eldest son. Emma sat to Thomas's left, her proximity to both the kitchen area and her father suggesting her dual role as domestic manager and youngest daughter requiring protection. Lucas, Peter, and Timothy arranged themselves along the remaining sides of the table, leaving the space that Rachel realized had been deliberately prepared for her. The chair was positioned where she could easily access the kitchen area if needed during the meal, but it was also integrated into the family circle rather than set apart as a servant's place. The thoughtfulness of the arrangement suggested that the children had discussed not just her sleeping accommodations, but also her place in family routines. Thomas bowed his head for a moment of silent grace, a practice that the children observed with varying degrees of attention and reverence. Benjamin maintained perfect stillness and apparent concentration, while Peter fidgeted slightly and Timothy's lips moved as though he was conducting his own private conversation with the Almighty. Emma kept one eye open to monitor the behavior of her younger brothers, ready to issue corrections if anyone's conduct fell below acceptable standards. The meal that followed was simple but abundant, the kind of hearty fare that sustained people engaged in physical labor in challenging environments. The beans had been seasoned with herbs that Rachel didn't immediately recognize, mountain plants that Emma had learned to identify and harvest under her mother's guidance. The cornbread was dense and slightly sweet, made with meal that had been ground at the mill in Cedar Falls and enhanced with honey from their own beehives. Conversation during dinner was relaxed but purposeful, covering practical matters like weather predictions, supply inventories, and plans for the next day's work. Thomas consulted with Benjamin about repairs needed on the chicken coop before winter weather set in, while Emma reported on the status of food preservation efforts and the condition of winter clothing that would soon be needed. Rachel contributed to the discussion by asking questions about local conditions and expressing interest in learning about mountain life. Her inquiries were received positively, suggesting that the family welcomed her genuine curiosity about their environment and lifestyle. When she asked about the source of the unusual seasoning in the beans, Emma brightened visibly and launched into a detailed explanation of wild herbs and their culinary applications. "Mama taught me to recognize wild sage and mountain thyme," Emma explained with obvious pride. She said that knowing which plants were safe and useful was one of the most important skills for mountain living. She made me practice identifying different leaves and flowers until I could find them with my eyes closed. The mention of their mother was natural rather than sorrowful, suggesting that enough time had passed for memories to become sources of comfort rather than pain. Rachel noted that the children seemed comfortable sharing Emma McKenna's wisdom and techniques, viewing her knowledge as a family legacy rather than a private treasure to be hoarded. After dinner, the family moved into their evening routine with the same practiced efficiency that had characterized meal preparation. Benjamin and Lucas handled dishwashing duties, working together in companionable silence while the younger children attended to their own responsibilities. Peter banked the fire for the night, ensuring that coals would remain alive to restart cooking flames in the morning. Timothy collected toys and personal items that had been scattered around the main room during the day. Emma approached Rachel with a book in her hands, a worn volume of fairy tales that had obviously been read many times. "Would you be willing to read to us tonight?" she asked politely. "Papa sometimes tells us stories, but he's not very good at doing different voices for the characters. Mama used to change her voice for every person in the story." The request was both an invitation and an opportunity to begin establishing her own relationship with the children. Rachel accepted the book gratefully, recognizing that bedtime stories were among the most intimate family rituals, moments when emotional connections were formed and strengthened through shared imagination and comfort. The children settled themselves around the fireplace with pillows and blankets, creating a cozy circle that had clearly been their customary story-listening arrangement. Thomas excused himself to attend to evening barn chores, but not before, giving Rachel an encouraging nod that suggested he approved of her integration into family routines. Rachel opened the book to a story she remembered from her own childhood, a tale about a miller's daughter who proved her worth through cleverness rather than beauty or birth. As she began to read, she found herself naturally falling into the rhythm of performance storytelling, changing her voice for different characters and adjusting her pace to build suspense at appropriate moments. The children responded enthusiastically to her dramatic reading style, giggling at silly voices and leaning forward during exciting passages. Even Benjamin, who had claimed to be too old for such entertainments, found himself drawn into the story. Despite his best intentions to maintain dignified detachment, Timothy curled up against Emma's side and sucked his thumb contentedly, his eyes growing heavy as the familiar comfort of bedtime routine worked its magic. When the story concluded, Emma led her brothers through their nighttime preparations with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to all household management. Each child had specific tasks to complete before bed, from washing faces and brushing teeth to saying prayers and arranging clothes for the following day. The routine was thorough without being excessive, ensuring that necessary hygiene and spiritual observances were maintained, while also providing the security that comes from predictable patterns. Rachel helped where appropriate, assisting Timothy with buttons that were too small for his fingers and braiding Emma's hair for the night. These small services were accepted naturally, suggesting that the children were already beginning to view her as a legitimate source of adult assistance, rather than an intrusive stranger. As the children dispersed to their various sleeping arrangements, Rachel found herself alone in the main room with the dying fire and the accumulated silence of evening. The cabin felt different now that she had participated in family routines, more like a home she belonged in rather than a place she was visiting. The transformation was subtle but significant, a shift in perspective that came from being needed and useful rather than merely tolerated. Thomas returned from the barn as she was banking the fire for the night, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. He moved quietly, conscious that children were settling into sleep in nearby rooms, and settled into the chair that was apparently his customary evening spot. "They seemed comfortable with you tonight," he observed, his voice pitched low to avoid disturbing anyone who might already be drifting toward sleep. "Emma hasn't asked anyone to read stories since her mother died. She usually insists on reading to herself, even though she struggles with some of the longer words." The information revealed both Emma's fierce independence and the significance of her willingness to accept Rachel's help with something so personally important. It also suggested that the little girl's careful management of family routines might be motivated less by natural leadership ability and more by the fear that no one else would maintain the traditions that connected them to their lost mother. "She's been carrying a heavy load," Rachel replied, settling into the chair that had been designated as hers during dinner. "They all have, but Emma especially seems to feel responsible for maintaining things that shouldn't be a 7-year-old's." "Concern." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful in the firelight. Emma's mother was very particular about family traditions and domestic routines. She believed that maintaining consistent patterns helped create security and stability for children. After she died, Emma appointed herself the keeper of those traditions, determined to preserve everything exactly as her mother had established it. The explanation clarified some of the dynamics that Rachel had observed during her first evening with the family. Emma's rigorous attention to detail and her resistance to changes in established procedures weren't just personality traits. They were coping mechanisms designed to maintain connection with her deceased mother and ensure that family life continued to reflect Emma McKenna's values and priorities. "It's a lot of responsibility for such a young child," Rachel said carefully, testing the waters of a potentially sensitive topic. Perhaps some of those traditions could be maintained while also allowing for adjustments that might make daily life a bit easier for everyone. Thomas considered this suggestion, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals in the fireplace. "Emma's been resistant to changes in the past," he said finally. "She gets upset when things are done differently than her mother did them, worried that we're forgetting or dishonoring her mother's memory. But she might be more willing to accept modifications if they came from another woman, someone she sees as understanding domestic matters in ways that I don't. The conversation revealed both the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead in Rachel's integration into the McKenna family. She would need to navigate carefully between respecting Emma's devotion to her mother's memory while also introducing improvements that would reduce the burden on all the children. Success would require earning Emma's trust and demonstrating that changes could honor the past while also making the present more manageable. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the settling sounds of a house preparing for night. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the darkness, its voice carrying the wild loneliness that belonged to mountain country. The sound seemed to emphasize their isolation from the civilized world, their dependence on each other, and their own resources for survival and comfort. "Winter comes early here," Thomas said eventually, breaking the silence with practical concerns. "We'll likely see snow within the next few weeks, and once it starts, we won't get to town again until spring-thaw. I want to make sure you understand what that means before you make your final decision about staying." The warning was delivered matter-of-factly rather than dramatically, but Rachel understood the seriousness behind it. Winter isolation in mountain country was complete and potentially dangerous, offering no escape routes for anyone who discovered that their living situation was unsatisfactory. If she decided to remain with the McKenna family through the first snowfall, she would be committed to the arrangement for months regardless of how well or poorly things developed. "What does winter isolation typically involve?" she asked, wanting to understand the full scope of what she was agreeing to accept. "Once the snow gets deep, the road becomes impassable for wagons or horses," Thomas explained. "We can still travel short distances on snowshoes if necessary, but it's dangerous and exhausting. We depend entirely on stored food, preserved goods, and whatever we can hunt in the immediate vicinity. If someone gets seriously injured or ill, we handle it ourselves or accept that medical help isn't available." The reality was sobering but not entirely surprising. Rachel had understood that mountain life involved greater self-sufficiency than valley living, but hearing the specifics made the isolation seem more concrete and immediate. She would be committing herself not just to caring for 5 children and managing a household, but to surviving winter in conditions that offered no outside support or assistance. "Have you managed alone through previous winters?" she asked, curious about how the family had coped with seasonal isolation, while also dealing with grief and the practical challenges of single parenthood. "We survived," Thomas said simply. "But it wasn't easy. The children did their best to help with everything, but there were tasks that were too difficult or dangerous for them to handle safely. We got through by accepting that some things would be done poorly or not at all, and by being grateful for what we managed to accomplish rather than worrying about what we couldn't." The admission revealed both the family's resilience and the real hardships they had endured. Rachel could imagine 5 children and their grieving father struggling through long winter months with inadequate domestic support, accepting substandard living conditions because they had no other options. The picture made her more determined to contribute meaningfully to their welfare rather than merely occupying space and consuming resources. "I think I understand what I'm committing to," she said after considering his warnings carefully. "And I think I'm prepared to make that commitment. But I want you to know that I expect to earn my place here through useful work, not just by being present. I don't want to be a burden that you accept out of charity or convenience." Thomas turned to look at her directly, his expression serious in the dim firelight. "You won't be a burden," he said with quiet certainty. "I've watched you with the children tonight, seen how you handle domestic tasks and respond to their individual needs. You understand what this family requires, and you have the skills to provide it. That's not charity, it's mutual benefit." The validation was more meaningful than elaborate compliments would have been, coming from someone who had observed her carefully and formed judgments based on practical evidence rather than wishful thinking. Rachel felt a measure of confidence settling into her chest. the first real assurance she had experienced that her presence in this household might prove genuinely valuable rather than merely tolerated. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, stirring the pine branches around the cabin and carrying the crisp scent that preceded weather changes in mountain country. Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, checking the sky for signs that might indicate what the night would bring. "Storm coming in from the west," he observed, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. "We'll likely have rain by morning, possibly the first snow of the season if the temperature drops enough overnight." The prospect of snow was both exciting and sobering. Rachel had never experienced winter in mountain country, had never lived through months of isolation and dependence on stored resources. The approaching storm felt symbolic of the threshold she was crossing, the point beyond which her new life would become irreversible for practical rather than emotional reasons. "Should we make any special preparations?" she asked, recognizing that her ignorance of mountain weather patterns was likely to be a significant handicap in the months ahead. "The children know what to do," Thomas replied. "They've learned to secure anything that might blow away in high winds and to bring extra firewood inside before storms hit. Benjamin will check on the animals first thing in the morning, and Emma will make sure we have enough water stored inside in case the creek freezes." The confidence with which he described the children's storm preparations was both impressive and slightly sad, evidence of how much adult responsibility they had been forced to assume during their father's period of single parenthood. Rachel made a mental note to learn these procedures quickly, so she could take over some of the burden that currently fell on shoulders too young to carry such weight. As if summoned by the discussion of his responsibilities, Benjamin appeared in the doorway that led to the children's sleeping area. He was dressed in nightclothes but clearly still awake, possibly unable to sleep due to awareness of the approaching weather change. "Papa," he said quietly, "I can hear the wind picking up. Should I go secure the chicken coop gate now, or wait until morning?" The question revealed the depth of Benjamin's sense of responsibility for family welfare and his understanding of the practical requirements of mountain living. At 14, he was already thinking like an adult about potential problems and preventive measures, displaying the kind of mature judgment that developed when children were forced to grow up quickly. "Morning will be soon enough," Thomas replied. "The coop is well built, and the gate latch is strong enough to hold through ordinary wind. But thank you for thinking of it." Benjamin nodded and seemed about to return to bed when he hesitated, his attention shifting to Rachel. "Miss Harper," he said formally, "would you like me to show you around the property tomorrow, so you can learn where everything is located and understand how we manage the various operations?" The offer was both practical and generous, an indication that Benjamin was prepared to accept her presence and help her integrate into family routines. It also suggested that he understood the importance of ensuring that all adults in the household possessed necessary knowledge about their environment and resources. "I would appreciate that very much," Rachel replied. "I want to learn everything I can about how this place operates, so I can contribute effectively to its management." Benjamin smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had seen from him since her arrival. "There's a lot to see," he said with obvious pride in his family's accomplishments. "We've built most of the outbuildings ourselves, and we've developed systems for managing everything from food storage to animal care. Mama always said that self-sufficiency was the key to mountain living." With that pronouncement, he disappeared back into the sleeping area, leaving Rachel and Thomas alone again with the growing sound of wind in the trees outside. The storm was definitely approaching, bringing with it the kind of weather that would test both the cabin's structural integrity and its inhabitants' preparedness for seasonal challenges. Rachel realized that she was no longer thinking about the approaching storm as something that would happen to other people while she remained safely separate from its effects. She was now part of a mountain household, someone who would share in both the work of preparation and the experience of weathering whatever nature decided to deliver. The psychological shift from observer to participant felt significant, a recognition that her commitment to this new life was already becoming real in ways that went beyond formal agreements and practical arrangements. Thomas banked the fire carefully, ensuring that coals would survive the night to provide starting material for tomorrow's cooking and heating needs. His movements were economical and precise, reflecting years of experience with the practical requirements of maintaining warmth and safety in challenging conditions. "We should get some sleep," he said, though he made no immediate move toward his own bed. "Tomorrow will be a full day, especially if the weather turns difficult. The children will need extra attention during their first storm with someone new in the house." The comment reminded Rachel that her presence would affect how the family responded to challenges, that her integration into their routines was still incomplete and potentially fragile. Children who had learned to depend entirely on each other, and their father might find it difficult to trust a newcomer during stressful situations, regardless of how well things had gone during calm periods. "Is there anything specific I should know about how they handle storms?" she asked. "Individual fears or needs that I should be prepared to address?" Thomas considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Timothy sometimes gets frightened by loud noises, thunder and wind particularly. Emma tries to take care of him, but she gets anxious herself and sometimes needs reassurance that everything will be all right. Lucas tends to withdraw and become very quiet during stressful situations. Peter usually handles storms well, but he has a tendency to take unnecessary risks, like wanting to go outside during high winds to check on animals." The information provided Rachel with a framework for understanding how each child might respond to challenging weather, allowing her to prepare appropriate responses and support strategies. She felt grateful for Thomas's willingness to share these insights, recognizing that such knowledge would be crucial for her success in caring for children who had already experienced significant trauma and loss. They separated for the night, with quiet goodbyes, each retreating to private spaces to prepare for sleep. Rachel's small room felt cozy and secure, protected from the growing wind by solid log walls and tight-fitting windows. She arranged her few belongings in the simple furniture and settled into bed with a sense of cautious optimism about the days ahead. Outside, the storm continued building, but inside the McKenna cabin, 6 people prepared for sleep with the confidence that came from sturdy shelter and careful preparation. For the first time in many months, Rachel fell asleep knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she was simply a woman in a warm bed, surrounded by people who needed her skills and seemed prepared to value her contributions. The sound of wind in the pine trees became a lullaby rather than a threat, carrying her toward dreams that were filled with hope rather than fear, with possibilities rather than limitations. Whatever the morning might bring, she would face it as a member of the McKenna family, someone who belonged in this mountain place and had a right to call it home. The Mountain Man's Story, final part. The storm arrived just before dawn, bringing with it the season's first serious snowfall and winds that howled through the pine trees like something wild and untamed. Rachel woke to the sound of shutters rattling against their hinges and the peculiar muffled quality that heavy snow brings to familiar sounds. Through her small window, she could see that the world had transformed overnight into something white and pristine, beautiful but also potentially dangerous for people dependent on their own resources for survival. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on the warmest clothes she owned and wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before venturing into the main room. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night, and the cabin felt distinctly chilly despite the solid construction and careful banking of heat sources. She could hear movement in other parts of the house, suggesting that the entire family was responding to the weather change with practiced efficiency. Thomas appeared from his sleeping area fully dressed and ready for outdoor work, his heavy coat already buttoned against the cold. He moved immediately to the fireplace and began building up the fire, adding kindling and larger pieces of wood with the economical motions of someone who had performed this task countless times under similar conditions. "How much snow?" Rachel asked, keeping her voice low to avoid waking any children who might still be sleeping. 8 inches, maybe 10, Thomas replied without looking up from his fire-building efforts. "Still coming down hard, and the wind's getting stronger. We'll be snowed in for at least a few days, possibly longer if this keeps up." The matter-of-fact delivery of this information contrasted sharply with Rachel's internal sense of alarm at the prospect of complete isolation so soon after her arrival. She had intellectually understood that winter weather would cut them off from outside contact, but experiencing the reality of being trapped by natural forces felt more immediate and concerning than she had anticipated. Benjamin emerged from the children's area, already dressed for barn work and carrying a lantern that would provide necessary light for morning chores in storm conditions. At 14, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and was prepared to do it regardless of weather or other complications. "Animals are probably anxious," he said to his father, pulling on heavy gloves and a wool hat. "I'll check on them and make sure they have enough feed and water to last through the storm." "Take the rope line," Thomas instructed, referring to a safety measure that Rachel didn't yet understand, but that Benjamin obviously recognized immediately. "Visibility's poor enough that you could get turned around between here and the barn." The exchange revealed the serious nature of mountain storms and the genuine dangers they posed even to people who were familiar with local conditions. Rachel made a mental note to learn about these safety procedures as quickly as possible, recognizing that her ignorance of mountain weather patterns could potentially put herself or others at risk. Emma appeared next, moving with the purposeful efficiency that characterized all her domestic activities. She had already pinned her hair back neatly and was wearing an apron over her dress, prepared to begin breakfast preparations despite the early hour and challenging conditions. "Should I start extra porridge?" she asked her father, clearly thinking about the increased caloric needs that cold weather would impose on everyone in the household. "And should I prepare hot tea for Benjamin when he comes back from the barn?" The 7-year-old's automatic consideration of others' needs and comfort struck Rachel as both admirable and somewhat heartbreaking. Emma had learned to anticipate and address family requirements with a level of sophistication that exceeded her chronological age, taking on emotional and practical burdens that belonged more properly to adults. "That would be helpful," Thomas confirmed, then added gently, "But let Miss Harper assist you with anything that involves handling hot water or heavy pots. Storm conditions make everything a bit more dangerous than usual." The instruction represented a subtle shift in household dynamics, acknowledging Rachel's role as the adult responsible for managing domestic safety while also preserving Emma's position as someone whose contributions were valued and necessary. Emma nodded seriously and moved toward the kitchen area, clearly prepared to work cooperatively with Rachel rather than competing for authority. Rachel followed Emma to the cooking area and began helping with breakfast preparations, noting the different requirements that storm conditions imposed on routine activities. Water had to be heated in larger quantities to ensure adequate supplies if pipes froze during the day. Food preparation needed to account for the possibility that family members might be confined indoors for extended periods. Even simple tasks, like lighting oil lamps, required extra attention to safety considerations when wind might affect ventilation or create unexpected drafts. Lucas and Peter appeared as breakfast preparations were reaching completion, both boys showing the slightly rumpled appearance of children who had been awakened by weather. Rather than arising naturally at their customary hour, they moved quietly through their morning routines, clearly understanding that storm conditions required modified behavior and increased attention to family cooperation. Timothy was the last to emerge, still wearing his nightclothes, and rubbing sleep from his eyes with the confused disorientation of a 5-year-old who couldn't immediately understand why the familiar world outside had changed so dramatically. Overnight, he wandered to the window and stood staring out at the swirling snow with the fascinated attention that young children bring to natural phenomena. "Why is everything white?" he asked, his question directed to no one in particular, but clearly expecting an adult to provide a satisfactory explanation. "Winter came early this year," Emma replied, taking on the teaching role that she had apparently assumed for her youngest brother's benefit. "The snow will stay until spring, and we'll need to be extra careful about staying warm and making sure we have enough food stored inside the house." Timothy accepted this explanation with the philosophical resignation that young children often display toward adult decisions about seasonal changes and household management. He allowed Emma to help him dress for the day and joined the family circle around the breakfast table without further questions about meteorological developments. Benjamin returned from his barn duties as the family was finishing their morning meal, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice crystals from his coat before entering the main living area. His cheeks were red from cold exposure, and his movements carried the satisfaction that comes from completing necessary work under challenging conditions. "Animals are secure and well supplied," he reported to his father. "The chickens are nervous about the wind, but they're warm enough in the coop. The mule and cow have plenty of hay and fresh water. I reinforced the barn door latch and I checked all the building foundations for snowdrift problems." The thorough nature of his report revealed both Benjamin's competence and his understanding of the serious responsibilities that storm conditions placed on every member of the household. At 14, he was already thinking like an adult about potential problems and preventive measures, displaying the kind of mature judgment that developed when children were forced to grow up quickly in demanding environments. Thomas nodded approvingly at his son's report, then turned his attention to the broader question of how the family should organize their activities during what might prove to be several days of storm-enforced confinement. "We'll use this time for indoor projects that usually get postponed during busy seasons," he announced. "Benjamin, you can work on repairing harness leather and sharpening tools. Lucas and Peter can help me with furniture repairs and maintenance tasks that don't require access to the workshop." The assignment of productive activities during forced indoor time reflected the family's practical approach to mountain living, their understanding that survival depended on using every available opportunity to prepare for future challenges and maintain essential equipment. Rachel admired the way Thomas managed to frame necessary work as purposeful activity, rather than merely busy work designed to occupy restless children. "What about lessons?" Emma asked, clearly concerned about maintaining educational routines. Despite unusual circumstances, Mama always said that learning shouldn't stop just because weather made normal activities impossible. The question revealed another aspect of Emma's sense of responsibility for preserving family traditions and maintaining standards that she associated with her mother's approach to child rearing. Rachel recognized an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to family life while also supporting Emma's commitment to educational continuity. "I'd be happy to help with lessons," Rachel offered. "I have some experience with teaching, and storm days might actually provide good opportunities for concentrated learning without the usual outdoor distractions." Emma's face brightened at this suggestion, clearly pleased that her concern for educational maintenance had been taken seriously and addressed with practical solutions. "Mama had books for arithmetic and reading," she explained eagerly, "and she started teaching me about household accounting and supply management. Benjamin knows some geography and history, but the younger boys need help with basic reading and writing skills." The discussion that followed revealed both the educational accomplishments that the children had achieved under their mother's guidance and the gaps that had developed during the period when Thomas had been managing single parenthood while also handling all outdoor work and economic responsibilities. Rachel began to understand that her contribution to family life could extend well beyond basic domestic maintenance to include intellectual development and preparation for adult responsibilities. The storm continued throughout the morning, with wind speeds that made venturing outside genuinely dangerous and snow accumulation that would have made travel impossible even under calmer conditions. The family settled into modified routines that accommodated their enforced confinement while maintaining productive activity and social harmony. Rachel found herself naturally taking on coordination responsibilities for indoor activities, helping to manage conflicts between different age groups' needs and ensuring that shared spaces remained organized and functional despite increased occupancy. Her experience with managing complex household operations proved valuable in the confined environment of storm day living, where careful attention to logistics could mean the difference between comfortable togetherness and irritating chaos. By midday, the cabin had achieved a comfortable rhythm of productive activity and family interaction. Benjamin worked quietly at the main table, cleaning and oiling leather goods with the careful attention that such tasks required. Lucas and Peter had established themselves near the fireplace with books and writing materials, taking advantage of the best available light for educational activities. Emma had appointed herself supervisor of general domestic operations, moving between different areas of the cabin to ensure that everyone's needs were being met and that shared resources were being used efficiently. Timothy alternated between quiet play with wooden toys and attempts to participate in his older siblings' more sophisticated activities. Thomas moved between various maintenance tasks, addressing small repairs and improvements that had been accumulating during busy outdoor work seasons. Rachel observed that he possessed considerable skill in woodworking and mechanical problem-solving, abilities that were clearly essential for maintaining a self-sufficient mountain household where professional repair services were unavailable. The afternoon brought a temporary reduction in wind intensity, though snow continued falling steadily and showed no signs of ending anytime soon. The family took advantage of the calmer conditions to attend to tasks that required brief ventures outside, such as collecting firewood from covered storage areas and checking on animal welfare. Rachel accompanied Benjamin on one of these expeditions, wanting to learn about storm safety procedures and understand the layout of outbuildings that she would need to navigate independently in future weather emergencies. The experience proved both educational and humbling, revealing how much specialized knowledge was required for safe operation in mountain winter conditions. The cold was more intense than anything she had previously experienced, penetrating clothing and stealing breath in ways that made extended outdoor exposure genuinely dangerous. The wind, even at reduced intensity, created drifting snow conditions that could quickly disorient someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Benjamin moved through these conditions with practiced competence, but Rachel realized that she would need considerable experience before she could operate safely in such an environment. "The first winter is always the hardest," Benjamin observed as they returned to the cabin with armloads of firewood. "You'll learn to read weather signs and understand how different conditions affect daily routines. By next year, you'll be able to handle storm days without thinking much about the challenges." The casual assumption that she would still be part of the family during the following winter struck Rachel as both encouraging and slightly overwhelming. Benjamin clearly viewed her presence as a permanent addition to household operations rather than a temporary experiment, suggesting that her integration into family life was proceeding more successfully than she had dared to hope. Evening brought the family together around the fireplace for the kind of extended social interaction that storm conditions made both necessary and pleasant. With outdoor work impossible and travel unthinkable, they had no choice but to depend on each other for entertainment and intellectual stimulation. The enforced togetherness might have been stressful under different circumstances, But the McKenna family seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company and handle proximity well. Rachel contributed to the evening's activities by sharing stories from her own childhood and asking questions about family history and mountain life experiences. The children responded enthusiastically to her interest in their lives and accomplishments, clearly pleased to have an adult audience for their adventures and achievements. Thomas proved to be a skilled storyteller when encouraged to share tales from his own youth and early experiences in mountain country. His accounts of learning to navigate wilderness conditions and establish a self-sufficient household were both entertaining and educational, providing insights into the development of skills and knowledge that the children would eventually need to master themselves. As bedtime approached, Rachel realized that the storm day had provided an accelerated introduction to family dynamics and individual personalities that might have taken weeks to develop under normal circumstances. The enforced intimacy of shared confinement had revealed strengths and needs that she could begin addressing immediately rather than discovering gradually over time. Emma's fierce independence and sense of responsibility had become even more apparent under stress conditions, but so had her underlying need for adult support and validation. Benjamin's maturity and competence were impressive, but Rachel could also see signs of the emotional burden that early responsibility had placed on his shoulders. Lucas's quiet thoughtfulness had manifested as genuine helpfulness during the day's activities, while Peter's energy and enthusiasm had proven valuable for maintaining family morale during potentially stressful conditions. Timothy's adaptability and trust had made him easy to care for, but Rachel also recognized his need for consistent attention and affection. The storm began to subside during the night, with wind speeds decreasing and snowfall becoming lighter and more intermittent. By morning, the immediate crisis had passed, though several feet of accumulated snow would continue to make travel difficult for some time. The family emerged from their storm confinement with a sense of accomplishment and strengthened bonds, rather than the irritation and restlessness that enforced proximity might have produced. Rachel found herself thinking about the experience as a successful test of her ability to contribute meaningfully to family life under challenging conditions. She had proven useful during crisis management, had connected successfully with all 5 children, and had begun to understand the practical requirements of mountain living during harsh weather seasons. More importantly, she had begun to feel genuinely at home in the McKenna cabin, confident in her right to be there and optimistic about her ability to fulfill the responsibilities that came with permanent membership in a mountain family. The storm had accelerated her integration into established routines and relationships in ways that might have taken much longer under ordinary circumstances. The days that followed brought gradual clearing of weather conditions and resumption of normal outdoor activities, but they also brought confirmation that Rachel's place in the family had been solidified rather than merely tested by the crisis. The children continued to seek her assistance and company in ways that suggested genuine affection rather than mere politeness, and Thomas began including her in planning discussions about future household operations and improvements. Winters settled into the mountain valley with the kind of persistent cold that would define daily life for the next several months. But the McKenna cabin remained warm and comfortable, filled with the sounds and activities of a family that had learned to thrive rather than merely survive in challenging conditions. Rachel had found her place in a world where she was valued for her contributions rather than judged for her failures, where her intelligence and independence were seen as assets rather than defects. The arrangement that had begun as a desperate solution to mutual problems had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful, a genuine family bond that would endure long beyond the practical circumstances that had originally brought them together. In the warmth of the cabin, surrounded by people who needed her skills and appreciated her presence, Rachel Harper had finally discovered what it meant to be home. Years later, when travelers passed through the mountain valley and asked about the McKenna family, local people would speak of Thomas the lumberjack and his wife Rachel, who had raised 5 children together and built a reputation for hospitality and integrity that extended far beyond their isolated homestead. The children grew into adults who carried forward the values and skills they had learned in the mountain cabin, contributing to their communities and raising families of their own. With the same combination of practical competence and genuine affection that had characterized their childhood home, Emma became a teacher in Cedar Falls, known for her ability to help struggling students discover their own potential and develop confidence in their abilities. Benjamin took over the family lumber operation and expanded it into a business that provided employment for dozens of local men while maintaining the environmental stewardship principles his parents had taught him. Lucas became a doctor, driven by memories of mountain winters when medical help was unavailable and determined to ensure that other isolated families would have access to professional care when they needed it most. Peter established a guide service that helped newcomers learn to navigate mountain conditions safely, sharing his knowledge of wilderness survival with people who were drawn to mountain life but lacked essential skills. Timothy became a minister, inspired by the example of family love and mutual support he had experienced during his formative years. His sermons were known for their emphasis on practical Christianity and the importance of creating communities where everyone could find a place of belonging and purpose. Rachel and Thomas aged together in the cabin where they had first learned to trust and depend on each other, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of love that had grown from practical necessity into something enduring and beautiful. When they were finally laid to rest in the mountain cemetery overlooking the valley they had called home, their graves were marked with stones that bore simple inscriptions, reflecting the truth that had shaped their lives together. Thomas's stone read, "He chose love over loneliness and built a family from hope and determination." Rachel's marker carried the words, "She was valued not for what she couldn't give, but for everything she was." Together, the inscriptions told the story of two people who had found in each other the completion they had been searching for, who had proven that families could be built from choice and commitment as surely as from blood and tradition. The cabin itself continued to shelter families for generations, passing down through the McKenna line to children and grandchildren who understood its significance as more than just a dwelling place. It remained a symbol of the possibility that people could overcome their past failures and disappointments to create new lives filled with purpose and belonging, that love could grow from practical necessity into something that transcended the circumstances of its origin. Visitors to the valley still occasionally ask about the old McKenna place, drawn by stories of the mountain man who chose a discarded woman and built with her a family that became legendary for its strength and harmony. Local historians tell them about Thomas McKenna, who saw value where others saw only failure, and about Rachel Harper McKenna, who proved that worth is not measured by conventional standards, but by the capacity to love and be loved in return. The story has become part of the folklore of the region, passed down through generations as an example of how ordinary people can create extraordinary lives when they choose to see possibilities rather than limitations, when they build relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment rather than social expectations and superficial attractions. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings when snow falls softly through the pine trees and firelight glows warmly in cabin windows throughout the valley, people still speak of the lesson that Thomas and Rachel McKenna taught through the simple act of choosing love over fear, of building a life together that honored both their individual strengths and their shared dreams of belonging to something larger and more meaningful than themselves. Spring returned to Copper Ridge with the kind of sudden intensity that only mountain country could produce, transforming the landscape from winter white to vibrant green in what seemed like a matter of days. The creek behind the McKenna cabin swelled with snowmelt, rushing over rocks with a musical sound that had been silenced for months by ice and cold. Wild flowers pushed through the last patches of snow, creating splashes of color that seemed almost impossibly bright after the monochrome palette of winter. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, watching Timothy chase butterflies through the meadow while Emma hung laundry on the line that Thomas and Benjamin had strung between two sturdy pine trees. The sight filled her with a contentment that she had never expected to experience, a deep sense of rightness about her place in this mountain world and this family that had grown around her like something natural and inevitable. The winter had tested them all in ways that went far beyond the practical challenges of surviving harsh weather and isolation. There had been moments of illness when Rachel's knowledge of herbs and healing had proved essential for the family's welfare. There had been times of scarcity when her ability to stretch resources and create meals from limited supplies had meant the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine hardship. Most importantly, there had been countless small moments when her presence had provided comfort and stability that Thomas alone could not have managed, when her attention to emotional needs had helped the children navigate the complex process of accepting a new maternal figure without feeling disloyal to their mother's memory. Emma had been perhaps the greatest challenge, her fierce independence and determination to preserve her mother's legacy, creating tensions that required careful navigation and infinite patience. But gradually, over the course of long winter evenings, spent working together on domestic projects, the little girl had begun to accept that Rachel's contributions enhanced rather than threatened the traditions that connected the family to Emma McKenna's influence. The breakthrough had come during a particularly difficult week in February when both Peter and Lucas had fallen ill with a fever that left them weak and unable to eat solid food. Rachel had spent 3 days and nights nursing them back to health, brewing medicinal teas and applying cooling compresses, while monitoring their temperatures and adjusting their care based on subtle changes in their conditions. Emma had worked beside her throughout the crisis, learning techniques for patient care and gaining appreciation for the specialized knowledge that Rachel brought to family emergencies. When the boys finally recovered, Emma had looked at Rachel with new respect and said simply, "Mama would have been proud of how well you took care of them." The comment had marked a turning point in their relationship, acknowledging that Rachel's maternal care could honor Emma McKenna's memory rather than competing with it. From that moment forward, Emma had begun referring to Rachel as Mama Rachel, a designation that preserved her birth mother's unique position, while also recognizing the reality of daily caregiving and emotional support. Benjamin had presented different challenges, his premature assumption of adult responsibilities, creating resistance to any changes that might diminish his importance to family operations. But Rachel had been careful to consult him on major decisions and continue acknowledging his contributions as essential rather than merely helpful, gradually earning his trust and cooperation. The moment when Benjamin had truly accepted her had come during a March blizzard that had trapped them inside for nearly a week. Cabin fever had begun affecting everyone's mood, and tensions were rising between the younger children who were bored and restless. Rachel had organized educational games and storytelling competitions that had transformed potential conflict into enjoyable family entertainment, demonstrating leadership skills that complemented rather than replaced Benjamin's practical competence. Afterward, Benjamin had approached her privately and said, "I was wrong to think that accepting help from you meant I was failing in my responsibilities to the family. I understand now that families work better when everyone contributes what they do best." Lucas had been perhaps the easiest of the children to connect with, his quiet nature and love of learning creating natural opportunities for bonding through shared intellectual interests. Rachel had introduced him to books from her own collection, including poetry and philosophy, that expanded his understanding of the world beyond mountain boundaries. Their relationship had deepened through long conversations about literature and ideas, discussions that had helped Lucas process his grief for his mother while also developing his own thinking about life and meaning. Rachel had been careful not to try replacing the emotional connection he had shared with Emma McKenna. instead offering him a different kind of intellectual companionship that met needs his mother had not been able to address. Peter's exuberant nature and natural curiosity had made him relatively easy to win over, though his tendency toward mischief had required careful management to channel his energy in productive directions. Rachel had discovered that Peter responded well to challenges that allowed him to demonstrate his problem-solving abilities, and she had begun involving him in projects that utilized his creativity and enthusiasm. Timothy, as the youngest, had adapted most readily to Rachel's presence, accepting her care and affection with the trusting nature of a child who had few clear memories of alternative arrangements. But even Timothy had needed time to understand that loving Rachel did not require forgetting his birth mother, that families could expand to include new people without diminishing the importance of those who were gone. Thomas had been perhaps the most complex relationship to navigate, their connection evolving gradually from practical partnership to genuine emotional intimacy. The formal boundaries that had characterized their initial arrangement had slowly dissolved as shared responsibilities and mutual respect created opportunities for deeper understanding and affection. The transformation had been subtle rather than dramatic, marked by small moments of consideration and support, rather than grand romantic gestures. Thomas had begun seeking Rachel's opinion on decisions that extended beyond domestic management, acknowledging her intelligence and judgment in ways that made her feel valued as a complete person rather than merely a household employee. Rachel had found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, times when the children were settled for the night, and they could talk freely about their hopes and concerns for the family's future. These discussions had revealed Thomas's depth of character and his commitment to creating an environment where all the children could thrive despite the challenges they had faced. The shift from partnership to love had been so gradual that neither of them could identify exactly when it had occurred. But by the time spring arrived, they had both acknowledged that their relationship had become something much deeper than the practical arrangement they had originally negotiated. The formal proposal had come on an evening in late March when the first signs of seasonal change were beginning to appear in the lengthening days and the subtle shift in air temperature that preceded snowmelt. Thomas had asked Rachel to walk with him to the overlook where they had first stopped during her journey to the cabin, the place where she had gotten her initial view of the valley that was now her home. Standing in the same spot where she had first gazed down at the miniature landscape spread below them, Thomas had taken her hand and said simply, "I want you to know that you'll always have a place here, not because of any arrangement we made in town, but because this family wouldn't be complete without you." Rachel had understood that he was offering her not just security, but genuine partnership, recognition that their relationship had evolved into something based on love and mutual choice rather than convenience and necessity. Her acceptance had been equally simple. "I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else with anyone else." The wedding had taken place in May, a simple ceremony conducted by the traveling minister who made regular circuits through the mountain communities. The entire valley had turned out for the celebration. Neighbors who had watched the McKenna family's recovery from tragedy and admired the way Thomas and Rachel had built something beautiful from difficult circumstances. Emma had insisted on helping with all the wedding preparations, her attention to detail ensuring that the ceremony honored both the joyous occasion and the memory of the woman whose place Rachel was formally taking. The little girl had presented Rachel with a bouquet that included flowers from Emma McKenna's garden, plants that had survived the winter and were blooming again as symbols of continuity and renewal. Benjamin had walked Rachel down the aisle in the absence of her own father, who had chosen not to make the journey from Millbrook despite the invitation they had extended. The gesture had meant more to Rachel than elaborate decorations or expensive gifts, representing the family's complete acceptance of her as one of their own. The reception had featured food contributed by families throughout the valley, a community celebration that acknowledged the McKenna family's importance to the broader social network of mountain people who depended on each other for support during difficult times. Rachel had been overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance she received from neighbors who had initially been skeptical about the arrangement between Thomas and the woman he had purchased in a public market. Mrs. Henderson, the wife of a neighboring rancher, had approached Rachel during the reception and said, "I'll admit I had doubts about how this situation would work out, but it's clear that you and Thomas were meant for each other. Those children have flourished under your care, and the whole family seems happier and more settled than they've been since Emma passed." The comment had been typical of the responses Rachel received throughout the evening, acknowledgments that her integration into the McKenna family had been successful, not just in practical terms, but in creating genuine happiness and stability for everyone involved. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities as the family worked together to expand their operations and improve their homestead. Rachel had suggested several modifications to domestic arrangements that would make daily life more efficient and comfortable, changes that the family had implemented with enthusiasm once they understood the benefits. She had also taken over complete responsibility for the vegetable garden, applying knowledge gained from her mother and experimentation with mountain growing conditions to produce larger and more diverse crops than the family had managed in previous years. The success of her gardening efforts had provided not just better nutrition, but also surplus produce that could be preserved for winter or traded with neighbors for goods they couldn't produce themselves. The children had continued to thrive under the stability that Rachel's presence provided, developing new skills and interests that reflected their individual personalities and talents. Benjamin had begun working with his father on more complex lumber projects, learning advanced techniques that would eventually allow him to take over the family business. Emma had discovered a talent for teaching, often helping her younger brothers with their lessons and demonstrating patience and creativity that suggested she might eventually become a professional educator. Lucas had continued developing his love of learning, reading everything he could find and showing particular interest in natural history and scientific observation. Peter had channeled his energy into outdoor pursuits, becoming an expert tracker and developing skills that would serve him well in mountain life. Timothy had grown into a confident and affectionate child who felt secure in the love and attention provided by his expanded family. The first real test of their permanent arrangement had come in late summer when representatives from a mining company had arrived with offers to purchase Thomas's land for copper extraction. The financial terms were generous enough to provide comfortable retirement for Thomas and education opportunities for all the children in more civilized locations. Rachel had participated in the family discussions about this opportunity, contributing her perspective on the advantages and disadvantages of leaving mountain life for more conventional circumstances. The conversations had revealed the depth of everyone's commitment to their current life and their reluctance to trade known satisfactions for uncertain benefits. The decision to refuse the mining company's offer had been unanimous, based not just on attachment to familiar surroundings, but on recognition that the family had created something valuable that could not be easily replicated elsewhere. They had built a life together that provided meaning and satisfaction for all of them, and they were unwilling to sacrifice that achievement for financial gain. Thomas had told the company representatives, "This land isn't for sale because we've put more into it than money can measure. We've built a home here, and homes aren't something you can pack up and move to a new location." The autumn that followed had been perhaps the most satisfying period of Rachel's life, a time when all the elements of her new existence had come together in perfect harmony. The children were healthy and happy, their individual personalities flowering under the security and attention they received from two parents who understood and valued their unique qualities. Thomas had become not just a husband, but a true partner. Someone who shared her commitment to creating the best possible environment for their family's growth and development. Their relationship had deepened beyond the practical cooperation that had characterized their early months together, evolving into genuine intimacy and affection that enriched every aspect of their daily life. The homestead itself had been transformed. From a place where people merely survived into a true home where a family thrived. Rachel's contributions to domestic management had created comfort and efficiency that made daily life pleasant rather than merely adequate. Her knowledge of healing and nutrition had improved everyone's health and energy levels, while her attention to educational and emotional needs had provided intellectual stimulation and emotional support that enhanced the quality of family life. Winter's return had found them better prepared than ever before, not just with adequate supplies and comfortable accommodations, but with the confidence that came from having successfully navigated previous challenges as a united family. The long evenings provided opportunities for the kind of intimate family interaction that created lifelong bonds and treasured memories. Rachel had established new traditions that complemented rather than replaced those that Emma McKenna had created, adding her own special touches to holiday celebrations and family rituals. Her storytelling abilities had become legendary among the children, who begged for tales of adventure and romance that transported them beyond the boundaries of their mountain world. The Christmas that marked Rachel's first full year as a McKenna had been celebrated with particular joy, recognizing not just the religious significance of the season, but also the family's gratitude for the transformations that had occurred in their lives. Each family member had received gifts that reflected thought and care rather than monetary value, tokens of affection that acknowledged individual interests and needs. Rachel had been overwhelmed by the presents she received, simple items made by hand that represented hours of loving labor and careful attention to her preferences. Benjamin had carved her a set of wooden spoons designed specifically for her cooking needs. Emma had embroidered handkerchiefs with mountain wildflowers that showed remarkable skill for such young hands. Lucas had written her a poem expressing his appreciation for the books and learning opportunities she had provided, while Peter had fashioned a small wooden box for storing her herbs and medicines. Timothy had drawn pictures of the family engaged in various activities throughout the seasons, artwork that captured the joy and love that characterized their daily life. Thomas had presented her with a simple gold locket containing photographs of all the children, a gift that acknowledged her role as their mother while also providing her with portable reminders of the family she had gained. The gesture had moved her to tears, representing not just his love, but his recognition that she had truly become part of something larger and more meaningful than herself. As winter deepened and the family settled into familiar patterns of cold weather life, Rachel often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of belonging contentment. The woman who had stood in Millbrook's town square, humiliated and desperate, had been transformed into someone who was valued and loved for exactly who she was. The transformation had not been magical or instantaneous, but had required months of patient work and gradual trust building. It had demanded that she prove herself worthy of the family's confidence, while also learning to accept love and appreciation that she had never experienced before. The process had been challenging, but ultimately rewarding beyond anything she could have imagined when she first climbed onto Thomas's wagon. The spring that marked Rachel's second year with the McKenna family brought news that would test their bonds in unexpected ways. A letter had arrived from Daniel Whitmore, Rachel's former husband, informing her that his second marriage had also failed to produce children and that he was interested in attempting a reconciliation based on his new understanding that the fault had not necessarily been hers alone. The letter had been forwarded through several intermediaries before reaching the remote mountain location, and its arrival had created emotional complications that Rachel had thought were safely in her past. Daniel's offer included financial support and the promise of a comfortable life in more civilized circumstances, opportunities that some people might have found difficult to refuse. Rachel had shared the letter with Thomas immediately, recognizing that honesty about her past was essential for maintaining trust in their marriage. Thomas had read the communication without comment, then handed it back to her with a simple question. "What do you want to do?" The question had forced Rachel to confront her feelings about her previous life and compare them honestly with her current circumstances. She realized that Daniel's offer, generous though it might be, represented a return to a world where her value was measured primarily by her ability to produce children, where her intelligence and independence were seen as potential problems rather than valuable assets. In contrast, her life with Thomas and the McKenna children provided her with respect and appreciation that were based on her complete self rather than her reproductive function. She was valued for her contributions to family welfare, her abilities as a teacher and healer, her skills in domestic management, and her capacity for love and nurturing that extended far beyond biological motherhood. Her response to Daniel had been brief and definitive. "I am grateful for your offer, but I have found my place with people who value me for who I am rather than what I might be able to provide. I wish you well in finding happiness, but my happiness has already been found." Thomas had said nothing when she showed him her reply, but his relief had been evident in the relaxation of tension she hadn't realized he was carrying. That evening, he had held her closer than usual and whispered, "I was afraid you might decide you wanted to go back to an easier life." Rachel had laughed at the suggestion, recognizing how completely her perspective had changed since arriving in the mountains. "This is the easier life," she had replied. "Easy because it's built on truth and acceptance rather than pretense and conditional approval." The years that followed had confirmed the wisdom of her choice, bringing continued growth and satisfaction as the family matured and evolved. The children had developed into capable and confident young people who carried forward the values they had learned in their mountain home. Benjamin had indeed taken over the lumber business, expanding it into a respected enterprise that provided employment for other families in the valley. Emma had become a teacher, as Rachel had predicted, known throughout the region for her ability to help struggling students discover their potential. Her approach to education reflected the patience and attention to individual needs that she had learned from watching Rachel work with her own brothers. Lucas had left the mountains to attend medical school, driven by memories of winters when professional medical care had been unavailable, and determined to return to serve mountain communities that lacked adequate health care. His letters home had described his studies with enthusiasm and his plans to establish a practice that would make medical care accessible to isolated families. Peter had established himself as a guide and outfitter for people seeking to experience mountain wilderness, sharing his knowledge of outdoor skills and natural history with visitors who were drawn to the beauty and challenge of high country life. His business had thrived as more people sought authentic experiences of frontier living. Timothy had grown into a thoughtful and spiritual young man who had decided to pursue ministry, inspired by the example of family love and community support he had experienced throughout his formative years. His sermons, delivered in mountain communities throughout the region, had emphasized practical Christianity and the importance of creating families and communities where everyone could find acceptance and purpose. Rachel and Thomas had aged together in the cabin where they had first learned to trust and depend on each other, their relationship deepening with each passing year as they shared the satisfactions of seeing their children thrive and establish families of their own. The grandchildren who began arriving in due course had brought new joy and purpose to their later years, providing opportunities to pass on traditions and values to another generation. The cabin itself had been expanded and improved over the years, but had retained its essential character as a place where family came first and where people were valued for their contributions rather than their social status or financial resources. It had become a gathering place for an extended network of children, grandchildren, and friends who had been influenced by the example of love and acceptance that Thomas and Rachel had created together. When travelers occasionally asked about the old McKenna place and the story of the mountain man who had married a woman purchased in a public market, Local people would correct the characterization with gentle firmness. Thomas McKenna hadn't purchased a woman, they would explain. He had recognized someone of value whom others had failed to appreciate, and he had offered her an opportunity to prove her worth in circumstances where her unique qualities could flourish. The story had become part of local folklore, not because it was unusual for mountain people to make practical arrangements for family formation, but because the McKenna family had demonstrated how such arrangements could evolve into relationships based on genuine love and mutual respect. Their example had influenced other families facing similar challenges, showing that successful marriages could be built on shared values and complementary abilities rather than romantic passion alone. Rachel's legacy in the mountain community had extended far beyond her role as Thomas's wife and mother to his children. Her knowledge of healing had made her a valued resource during medical emergencies, while her teaching abilities had improved education opportunities for families throughout the valley. Her example as a woman who had overcome adversity through intelligence and determination had inspired other women facing their own challenges and disappointments. The cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley eventually received Thomas and Rachel to rest side by side, their graves marked with stones that reflected the truth of their shared life. Thomas's marker read, "He saw worth where others saw failure and built a family from hope and love." Rachel's inscription stated simply, "She found her value not in what she lacked, but in all she had to give." The words had been chosen by their children working together, a collaborative effort that reflected the family unity that had been Thomas and Rachel's greatest achievement. The inscriptions told the story of two people who had found in each other the completion they had been seeking, who had proven that families built on choice and commitment could be just as strong as those based on conventional social arrangements. Visitors to the valley still occasionally ask about the McKenna family legacy, drawn by stories of the woman who had been rejected by her own community, but had found acceptance and love in the mountains. Local historians tell them about Rachel Harper McKenna, who had proven that a person's worth could not be measured by social expectations or biological functions, and about Thomas McKenna, who had possessed the wisdom to recognize true value when others could see only failure. The old cabin still stands, maintained by descendants who understand its significance as more than just a dwelling place. It serves as a reminder that love can grow from the most unlikely circumstances, that families can be created through choice and commitment as surely as through blood and tradition, and that people who seem broken or worthless to some eyes may possess treasures that only the wise can recognize and appreciate. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.